And thank you for inviting me to do this talk. Also, I want to point out that my research collaborator, Dr. Shang, is here, and I like to hold this out because it's an example of, I think, cross-disciplinary collaboration. He's in the Department of Engineering and also an expert in computer science, which comes greatly into play when you start talking about mobile assessment. What I want to talk about today is really more methods-based, and the idea is that traditionally when we assess people for substance use disorder, diagnoses and so forth, it's a cross-sectional assessment. We ask people to retrospect about what their life has been like over a certain period of time. The promise of this method, we call ambulatory assessment, is that actually we can assess people as they're going about their daily lives, and also we can kind of limit the amount of retrospection necessary. So we ask people, for example, what their mood has been like in the last 15 minutes or what happened. And essentially, we're collecting data almost in real time, and it has some great advantages over people having to retrospect, because it turns out, not just patients, but all of us are terrible historians. If I asked you what you did over this last weekend to kind of nail it down, most of you would make errors in that. But with this sort of methodology, we can actually see what's happening as people go about their daily lives. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about ambulatory assessment, kind of what it involves. Unlike many of the other techniques that we use in psychology and other social sciences, this is more idiographic in focus. And what I mean by this is that we're really studying individual processes because we're getting multiple assessments of the same person over time. So essentially, every person is his or her own control, and we can kind of map out, as I'll show you, sort of what's going on in their daily life over time. So it's characterized, as I mentioned, by these real-world environments. There's another huge advantage here. So we're not asking people what they're like when they're going about their daily lives. We're actually collecting data from them while they're going about their daily life. We focus on current or very recent states or behaviors so that we kind of limit that retrospection. Also, these assessments, you can kind of play around with different kinds of sampling. So you can do event-based assessments where you have people initiate a survey on a smartphone when X happens, like after the first alcoholic drink or after they have an urge for opioids, whatever it may be, you define it. But we also can do random prompts as well throughout the day to get a sense of kind of like, in general, what's sort of representative of their mood state over the day. And then also, as I'll point out, those random prompts often capture or catch people's lack of initiating a prompt when there's something of interest. So we, for example, in many studies that my colleague Tom Piasecki and others have done, we might catch maybe up to 50% of drinking occasions from random prompts as opposed to event-based prompts. And then finally, as I'll show you, we're getting multiple assessments over time, sometimes hundreds of assessments on the same individual. So the advantages here, again, is that we can characterize sort of dynamic processes. I'm a big, especially after using this research, everything changes. I mean, we like to think everybody is this and they're always like this, but in reality, whether it's our mood state, whatever, things are changing, and that makes some sense because we're facing different contexts throughout the day. This real-time assessment is going to minimize bias, and what is really lacking in all of psychopathology research, substance use disorder research, anything, is this temporal dimension to assessment. Because again, we do a one-time assessment and ask about what's happened over the last year. Here we could theoretically see exactly what happened over a year's time by taking these regular assessments. And there's really no substitute for the external validity because you're not in a controlled laboratory setting. Rather, we don't tell you what to do, and you just go about living your daily life. So we can capture kind of what people typically do, how they expose themselves to certain environments, to certain people, and so forth. And all of these things seem to have some impact upon whether or not people choose to use substances and whether or not they have problems with substances. I'm not going to go through this, but there's a long history of this. You may know some of these other names. Before we had electronics, this was called experience sampling, and people filled this out on papers, and they would be told to do it. There's some problems with it. People would backfill. They wouldn't do it on time, and so you didn't know whether to trust it. Most of you, if you're familiar, have heard of ecological momentary assessment. And ambulatory assessment is a larger umbrella that encapsulates EMA, but also we can start measuring physiology as well with external sensors, which I'll show you. And also there's some ways through either sensors and smartphones or other things that we can sort of passively capture things in the environment that people can't self-report. Okay, so as you might guess, the smartphone is really the game changer here. Before we did paper and pencil, then you had some of you that are older know personal digital assistants, PDAs. Our first studies, we did those. Most people don't even know what those are anymore, but they were you could use those as electronic diaries, but now we have smartphones. And the beauty of the smartphone is not only are people familiar with it, but it has Bluetooth capabilities, so it can really be used as an electronic diary. We have sensors, whether it's GPS or other things that we can tap into with the phone. And as I'll briefly mention, this can be like a hub for a wireless body network. So if you're wearing external sensors, they can Bluetooth the information to the smartphone, so you have an overlay of the physiology while you have the self-reports as well. Okay, so in case you didn't know, that's what a smartphone looks like. Here's the Apple and the Android. With our software, we can use both platforms. Everyone, or it seems like a lot of people, have Apple Watches, but you can have other just standalone devices that collect things like heart rate variability, electrodermal activity. And then if you really want to go crazy, which we do in my lab, is you find a Canadian company that makes a smart shirt for Canadian astronauts. Who knew that they had them? But we've used this in several studies, and here we can get respiration, we can get heart rate variability, heart rate, and some other things that are kind of harder to do from a risk-based assessment. Okay, so let's switch gears and let's focus on substance use. How do we use this to assess substance use and maybe addiction sorts of processes? I like to kind of break it down into, for self-report, so these would be surveys that are randomly prompted, or somebody says, I just had a drink or something. You might be asked about urges or craving, makes sense. The actual use, and so it's important, like how much have you had to drink, how often, how long. The major point here is that you need to capture that full episode, and I'll tell you a little bit about a strategy for trying to do a better job of that. Another important thing is motivations for use. So what we find is that if we ask this in the moment, sometimes those motivations for use differ significantly from what somebody told us on a questionnaire, what their motivations are for drug use or substance use. So capturing it in the moment is more proximal to the actual use of the substance and seems to have more validity. And then finally, the effects of the substance. That's super important as well. Are you getting sort of an arousal, disinhibitory effect? Is it sedating you? Things of that nature. And as several have mentioned, there are individual differences in how sensitive people are to certain substances, which seem to play a very important role in whether or not people use substances too much and ultimately become addicted to certain substances. Okay, so some overarching issues. I keep harping on sampling, but again, you can have an event base. So whether it's alcohol use, we've also done studies with cannabis use and opioid use. So you can instruct the person that's in the study, whenever you use, hit this button on the smartphone, and then you fill out surveys to tell us about how much and so forth. Again, what we find is that it's also important to ask about use in these random assessments, because people tend to not remember to hit the button for when they actually use, and we can catch it in that random assessment and then ask them the same questions we would have otherwise. And then super important are follow-ups. So it would be sometimes too much of a burden for some things, maybe to ask them to hit a button every time they drank, but if you have regular follow-ups, you can then capture the episode. So for example, with alcohol use disorder, you might, after they hit the button to say that they've had a drink, 30 minutes later say, have you had another drink since then? 60 minutes later, 90 minutes later, 120. If they say no there, then you've captured that episode. They had one drink. If they say at 60 minutes, yes, I had 2 more drinks, the clock starts over again. And so in this way, you get a much better sense of like how many drinks and what's happening throughout that episode of substance use. This shouldn't be surprising, but just this is kind of the wording, and I'll show you some screenshots. But this would be, for example, if maybe a random assessment, you'd ask this and you just ask how many drinks. And this is a great shot my colleague Tom Piasecki has for a new study that he's used. They're using our software. But one question always is, what is a drink? And fortunately, in the case of cigarettes and alcohol, it's a little easier to make sense out of that, because here you can actually show people, and now we're taking into account the, I'm an IPA drinker, so yeah, now beer is not a beer anymore, as it turns out. But you can kind of break it down, and people can use these standardized estimates of drinks. Why is that important? Well, you get a better sense of how many drinks, and then there are other things you can do, though. You can, if you weigh people, measure their height, their gender, you can actually estimate where they stand on the blood alcohol curve if you have this time stamped and tell over time how many drinks they've had. So there's something else you can do with this as well. The challenge, though, are on illicit substances, because like cannabis, at least in this state, and opioids, things like that, because there's not always standardization, especially things like heroin. You don't know, all you know is that you're shooting heroin, but you don't know where you got it from, whatever. Likewise with cannabis, it can range from what I call nitapod is 12% THC, but in reality, what we see on the streets, and we just recently did a study here in Columbia, most people are like 18 to 20% THC in the cannabis that they smoke. So you just don't know with some of these illicit substances without testing the substance what people are putting into their bodies. But for alcohol, we can come up with a pretty decent estimate. So, well, this is touchy. So this is kind of colorful, but basically this is one subject that was followed for, I think, 3 to 4 weeks. And this just to give you an idea of, if you look at one person, kind of what you can see from this. Up here are green stars or cannabis use. These triangles are alcoholic drinks, and the numbers are how many drinks they had at the time. We also have stuff like they got into a fight with their partner. This person had some binge eating problems as well. And these dots are kind of their mood state. And I haven't connected the dots, but this is just to show you how rich the data is for any one single individual. Of course, we have statistical techniques where we can throw this all together and come up with some, not only within the individual, some trends, but also across individuals. Okay, another thing, taking advantage of the smartphone and the Bluetooth would be to actually start collecting data on biomarkers. So beyond just asking people how much they're drinking, if you can maybe collect some data passively, semi-passively in some cases, you can get a better sense of how intoxicated they are. With Dennis McCarthy's study right now, we're using a breathalyzer, so we instruct people, the phone says, okay, go ahead and blow in it, and then we can get a sense at different time points, like what their BAC level is. This Scram device is used a lot. Some people don't like wearing it because it looks like you just got out of jail. And here's the newest sensor, which Unfortunately, we are not really using that much because it doesn't seem to be that good. But the idea is that through your sweat, you can get a sense of how much, and same thing with the scram, but here this would be risk-based, but there's some issues with this. Okay, so what have we learned from AA studies here? Individuals are different. Who knew? You go into psychology because you think, oh, people are so interesting, right? And yet sometimes through our research, we act like everybody's the same and we want to just kind of lump everybody together. Through this methodology, you can really see these individual differences, and this would have ultimately intervention or treatment implications. You may be wondering, do people actually do this? Yes. We get about 85 to 90% compliance. And there's a recent meta-analysis that's in press, and they looked at compliance by different substances. There are no differences depending on the substance, and there don't seem to be great differences in the length of the assessment period. Now, these people are getting reimbursed to do this, but in general, the important point is they seem to be, filling this out reliably. What do we know about comparing it to retrospective report? The old timeline follow back where you'd ask someone, sorry about that, to retrospect like over 30 days, like how many drinks they've had. If you compare that, even over the period where they're self-monitoring using it, what we find is people underreport how many drinks they've had when they retrospect as opposed to what's picked up by these electronic diaries. And not to mention the fact that people often are off days as to when they had their binge drinking episode. This, again, provides a much clearer picture of the dynamics of use and the associated mood changes, impulsivity changes, and so forth. And as I mentioned, some of our questionnaire-based assessments of important constructs like motivations and so forth, they don't seem to map on very well with what we see happens in daily life. That is, people may say they primarily drink to deal with negative affect, but if you look at the diary data, it's not like their affect built up before drinking and then went down after drinking. So we believe that by doing this in a more proximal way, we get better data about what's actually happening. And this is a big one, context matters. We sometimes, when we do just our traditional cross-sectional assessments, don't really talk about context that much or talk about it in very broad terms, but we have shown there's big differences like what time of the day, or weekend versus weekday, where you are, and whom you're with. Those things all impact whether or not you use and how much you use. Very quickly, I will tell you about this system that we've developed along with Dr. Shang here at MU. It's called Tiger Aware, and we built it out of necessity because I got tired of paying for a software developer to do an app for every time I did a study. So we made, basically it's a platform that can make apps for us. And without getting into the details, you can see you have the interface with a lot of external sensors. We're also playing around with a Google Home thing that can actually administer surveys. So people that are homebound or for whatever reason can't take a phone out, and you can actually administer surveys through Google Home as well. There's just some more detail about that. I'm happy to talk to you outside of this. And one thing we do like, this research kit that was developed by Apple that's used in TigerWare, they have behavioral tasks that are administered over the phone, and so some of these are very relevant to intoxication. So for example, this gait task, and we tried this out at a party recently, as it turns out. It was for science, but just put it in your pocket and you walk, and has very sensitive sensors that are then collecting data, and you can do it in a sober state in the lab, intoxicated in the lab, and then sober and intoxicated out in the real world. So you can actually do stuff in the lab and compare it to real world as well. Okay, this is just about Dennis's study. Dr. McCarthy, also Drs. Bartholow and Piasecki are studying sort of the sensitivity to alcohol effects and so forth, and they're also using this software as well. So just to conclude, sorry to speed through it, we can study these things in daily life. We get good compliance. We've gotten very interesting findings, sometimes findings that challenge some of the prevailing theories about substance use initiation. This is much better than retrospective assessment, and there are ways of kind of looking at impairment or combining the data that we get in real life with laboratory data to get a better picture of what may influence people to use a substance too much or to have problems with the substance. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important this last thing is, because by studying people in their daily life, you're letting them choose their context. You're not setting it, there's not an artificial context of the lab, but this is really how they're living their daily life. And you might be thinking the next kind of step, which is true, is that we can actually perhaps intervene in daily life. So for certain people, there's certain contexts that are going to be more problematic. You can remind them about skills use, other things like that, and that is kind of the next phase here. Okay, so thank you to my lab. This is by the getting Thai food on the river. Dr. Shang's lab as well, and also the funding support for over several years. I've been, probably about 15 years, I've been working in this area. That's it.